When Emily Carter, 31 years old, heiress to a $500 million real estate empire, walked into Matthews Auto Repair in the heart of Austin, Texas, with her gleaming red Ferrari and a problem no one seemed to understand, the men present reacted in two ways. Some looked at her with the unhealthy desire of those who only see a beautiful body and money to exploit. Others, with the irritation of those who have no patience for a woman gesturing desperately without speaking a comprehensible word. Nobody understood she was deaf. Nobody bothered to try to understand her. Nobody except Jake Matthews, 29 years old, a mechanic with oil-stained hands and a bank account that barely made it to the end of the month, who looked past the designer clothes and expensive car and simply saw a person who needed help. What happened next? What Jake did in the following weeks would become legend throughout Austin. Because sometimes true luxury isn't what you can buy, but what someone is willing to sacrifice to make you feel seen in a world that has stopped looking at you. And this is the story of how a poor mechanic with a heart of gold did the impossible for a woman the world treated as invisible, despite all her wealth. If you're ready for this story, write where you're watching this video from. Matthews Auto Repair was one of those places where time seemed frozen in the 70s. The walls were stained with decades of accumulated grease. The concrete floor bore the scars of 1,000 repairs. The air smelled of burnt rubber and motor oil. It was run by Bill Matthews, a 60-year-old man with a prominent belly and worker's hands, who had spent more time under cars than with his own family. He had 5 mechanics working for him, all men, all with that rough and direct mentality typical of those who work with their hands and have little time for delicacies. Jake Matthews was the youngest of the group. He had started as an apprentice at 16 when he had to drop out of school to help his sick mother pay bills after his father left them without a penny. He had learned the trade with almost religious dedication, becoming the shop's best technician despite his young age. His hands were magical with engines, capable of diagnosing problems others couldn't see, of fixing what seemed irreparable. But his real talent was different. He knew how to listen, not just to engines, but to people. That Tuesday afternoon in September, Jake was working under a Honda Civic when he heard the unmistakable sound of a powerful engine entering the shop's yard. He slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on his dirty blue coveralls, and stood breathless. A red Ferrari F8 Tributo was parked in the dusty shopyard, as out of place as a diamond in a pile of rocks. It was a car that cost more than Jake would earn in 10 lifetimes. The afternoon sun reflected off its perfect paint job, creating an almost painful contrast with the faded metal signs and rusted tools scattered around the shop. This was a machine that belonged on magazine covers and private racetracks, not in a working-class Austin neighborhood where most customers drove Hondas and Fords, held together by hope and duct tape. And from the driver's door stepped a woman who seemed even more out of place than the car itself. She was tall, maybe 5'7", with long blonde hair pulled back in an elegant ponytail. She wore a burgundy dress that probably cost as much as Jake's annual rent, sky-high heels clicking on the concrete with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over the shop. Sunglasses hid half her face, designer frames that Jake recognized from billboards he passed on his way to work. She had that refined beauty of women born with money, where every detail is perfectly curated. Manicured nails painted a soft pink, light but impeccable makeup that somehow survived the Texas heat, discreet but expensive jewelry that caught the light with every nervous movement. There was something almost fragile about her, despite the armor of wealth, like a porcelain doll that had wandered into a demolition derby. The other mechanics had all stopped to stare at her. Rick, the oldest after Bill, had made a vulgar whistle. Steve and Danny had laughed. Jake had felt his stomach tighten with embarrassment for others. The woman had removed her sunglasses, revealing clear green eyes that nervously scanned the environment. She had walked toward the group of men with uncertain steps, as if entering enemy territory, and then she had started gesturing. Her hands moved rapidly through the air, forming signs that Jake didn't understand, but that clearly had meaning for her. Her mouth opened slightly, as if trying to form words, but no comprehensible sound came out. Only guttural sounds, inarticulate, the kind of sounds someone makes when they've never learned to speak normally. Bill had looked at her with growing irritation, asking what she wanted in an increasingly loud tone, as if yelling could make himself better understood. She had continued gesturing with greater desperation, pointing at the Ferrari, then the hood, then making gestures that seemed to indicate the engine. Rick had laughed openly, saying if she had enough money for that car, she could afford to go to the Ferrari dealership instead of wasting their time. Danny had added a sexist comment about how women understood nothing about cars and that she probably just needed gas. Jake had seen humiliation paint itself on the woman's face. He had seen her cheeks redden, her eyes fill with held-back tears, her hands tremble as she desperately continued trying to communicate. And in that moment, he understood something the others didn't see. She was deaf. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. All those gestures weren't nervousness or strangeness, it was sign language. And she wasn't speaking because she couldn't, or because she had never learned. She was deaf, probably from birth, and had found herself in a hostile environment full of men treating her like an idiot instead of trying to help her. Jake felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at the situation, at his colleagues who were too busy laughing to see a human being in distress. He thought of his mother, how she always taught him that kindness costs nothing, that every person deserves dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. This woman, with her expensive car and designer clothes, was just as vulnerable as anyone else. Maybe more so in a world that didn't accommodate her needs. Jake stepped forward, walking toward her, while the others continued laughing and commenting. He stopped in front of her, waited for her to look him in the eyes, and then did the only thing that came to mind. He took his phone from his pocket, opened the Notes app, and typed, "Are you deaf?" He turned it toward her. The woman read, and her eyes widened. She nodded frantically, relief so pure on her face it was almost painful to see. Finally, someone understood. Jake continued typing. "What's wrong with the car?" She took out her own phone, a latest model iPhone in an expensive leather case, and typed rapidly. The engine was making strange noises, overheating. The oil light was on. She was afraid to drive all the way to Houston where she lived. Jake read, then looked up at her and smiled, a genuine kind smile that said, "I'll help you." And he saw something change in her face. The tension slid off her shoulders, tears stopped. She returned the smile with one so dazzling that Jake forgot to breathe for a moment. Bill intervened abruptly, asking what Jake was doing, saying they had other customers waiting. But Jake, for the first time in 10 years of work, had responded firmly to the boss. He explained the lady was deaf, that she had a genuine problem with the car, and that he would help her. Bill had muttered something about being too nice, but had gestured that he could proceed. The other mechanics shook their heads and returned to their work, leaving Jake with the mysterious woman and her impossible Ferrari. Jake guided her to the car, had her open the hood. When she did, he leaned in to examine the engine. It hadn't taken long to find the problem, a significant oil leak, a damaged hose, and what appeared to be the beginning of engine overheating. Repairable, but required time and specialized parts for a Ferrari. He took his phone and wrote, "Serious problem, but fixable. Needs special parts. 2 to 3 days. Expensive." She read and responded immediately. "How much?" Jake did a quick mental calculation and wrote a figure he knew was honest but high. She didn't even blink, just nodded and wrote, "Okay, when can I pick it up?" They exchanged information. Jake gave her the shop's number and his personal number. He wrote that he would call her with updates. She wrote that she preferred text messages for obvious reasons, and Jake felt stupid for not understanding that on his own. Before leaving, the woman did something Jake didn't expect. She took his oil-stained hand, the one he was about to withdraw embarrassed, and squeezed it hard. Then she typed on her phone, "Thank you for seeing me. 4 simple words that hit Jake harder than he would have thought possible. Thank you for seeing me. Not for fixing the car, not for being kind, but for seeing her as a person, as a human being worthy of respect and understanding. She left in a taxi, leaving the Ferrari at the shop, and Jake stood there looking at his phone where he had saved her number under the name she had given him, Emily. That evening, when he returned to his small apartment on the outskirts where he lived with his mother, Jake couldn't get Emily out of his head. He thought about what her life must be like, navigating a world made for those who hear when you can't. He thought about the humiliation she had suffered at the shop, and probably suffered constantly. He thought about those green eyes full of gratitude for the minimum of decent humanity. And that night, while his mother slept in the next room, Jake took his old laptop and started searching. He searched how to learn American Sign Language. He found YouTube videos, apps, online guides, and he started studying. Because Jake Matthews, 29 years old, mechanic with dirty hands and modest dreams, had decided to do something nobody expected from him. He had decided to learn an entire language just to be able to talk to a woman he had met for 10 minutes. Not because she was rich, not because she was beautiful, but because for the first time in a long time, he had seen someone who needed to be seen as much as he did. The following days, Jake worked on the Ferrari by day, and at night he studied. He had searched how to learn American Sign Language and found videos, apps, online guides. He watched YouTube tutorials on his phone during lunch breaks, practiced fingerspelling while waiting for parts to arrive, studied grammar rules on printouts he kept in his toolbox. Learning ASL proved more difficult than expected. It wasn't just memorizing signs. It was understanding a completely different grammar, a visual language that required spatial awareness and facial expressions he'd never thought about before. His fingers, skilled with wrenches and capable of the most delicate engine work, were clumsy and awkward, forming signs. He felt like a child learning to write for the first time, frustrated by hands that wouldn't cooperate. But Jake was stubborn, and every evening he sat at his small kitchen table practicing in front of a mirror, while his mother watched with curious affection. Emily sent messages every evening asking for updates. Jake responded with technical details. The conversations were formal, but there was something beneath the surface, a mutual curiosity neither dared express. On the 4th day, the Ferrari was ready. Jake had ordered the parts from a specialty supplier in Dallas, installed them with meticulous care, test-driven the car himself to make sure everything ran perfectly. He spent the night obsessively reviewing basic signs, his palms sweating with nervousness. What if he got it wrong? What if she was offended by his terrible attempt? What if she thought he was mocking her? When Emily arrived Friday afternoon, she seemed more relaxed. Jeans instead of the designer dress, a simple white blouse.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
Less makeup that made her look younger and somehow more approachable. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She smiled warmly at him when she saw him, and Jake felt his heart skip. Jake showed her the repairs using his phone. She asked intelligent questions that showed how much she understood about cars. When it came time to pay, before leaving, Jake did something that surprised her. He raised his hands and, with slow, uncertain movements, signed, "Thank you for your patience." Emily stopped cold, her eyes filled with tears. She wrote on her phone, "You learned ASL. For me." Jake nodded, his face red. He wrote, "Just a little. I wanted to be able to talk to you. Sorry if it's terrible." Emily wrote with trembling fingers, "Nobody has ever done anything like this for me. Nobody." They looked at each other in the noisy shopyard, isolated in their small, silent world. Then she took his hand, placed it on her throat, and signed slowly until he understood. "I want to teach you." Jake nodded, his heart beating incredibly fast. The sign language lessons became something deeper. Emily came to the shop twice a week, sitting in Bill's dusty office to teach Jake with infinite patience. Through those signs, Jake discovered her story. Emily was born deaf in a wealthy Houston family. Her father, Richard Carter, had built a real estate empire from scratch. Instead of learning sign language, he'd sent her to the best speech therapists, desperately trying to make her normal. She learned to read lips, to hide her deafness, to pretend. Her father saw deafness as a flaw to conceal. She grew up alone, even surrounded by people, invisible, even always being watched. Her father died 2 years ago, leaving her a fortune but no real emotional connection. She managed family properties, navigating meetings where everyone talked around her, never with her. Jake told her his story in return. Poor childhood, father who left, sick mother, abandoned dreams. For Emily, it wasn't failure, but nobility. She who always had too much saw richness in what he gave, sacrifice, unconditional love, dignity in honest work. Slowly, inevitably, something bloomed between them. When Jake signed and Emily laughed silently, when she corrected his mistakes and he blushed, when their gazes met and held too long. Colleagues began commenting. Bill teased him about his crush on the princess. Rick made vulgar comments. Jake ignored everything, protecting what he was building with her. 2 months after their first meeting, Jake gathered courage. He signed clumsily. "Can I take you to dinner?" Emily signed. "Do you know what it means? In my circles, our worlds." Jake took her hands. He signed, trembling. "I know exactly what it means, and I don't care." The smile she gave him was worth any consequence. The first dinner was at a small diner in Jake's neighborhood. She arrived in jeans and sweater, no jewelry, finally looking free. They communicated in sign language and glances that said more than 1,000 words. After dinner, they walked the streets, and in a quiet alley, Jake finally kissed her, his hands still signing something when their lips met. The following months were the happiest either had ever known. Jake brought her into his world. Picnics, movies with subtitles, visits to his mother, who immediately adored Emily. But when she brought him into her world, everything changed. At a private art show, the looks were of curiosity and disdain. Who was this man in a borrowed jacket? People stared at his oil-stained hands, measured his worth in dollars. Worse still, when they discovered Emily was deaf and Jake signed with her instead of including, they excluded even more. They talked over her, treated Jake like a translator instead of her partner. Emily's mother discovered the relationship. She summoned her daughter and asked if she'd lost her mind. A mechanic? A poor nobody? Emily defended Jake fiercely, but her mother's words planted doubts. Was she dragging Jake into a world that would always reject him? Jake felt the distance growing. One night, after another difficult dinner, he stopped her on the street. He signed, "Do you think I'm not good enough for you?" Emily shook her head, tears falling. She signed, "I think you're too good for me, too good for this world that judges you. I don't want you to suffer for me." Jake took her hands. He signed, "Love is worth the suffering. You're worth everything." And they embraced on the street as passers-by watched. But for once, it didn't matter to either of them. The breaking point came 3 months later. Emily's mother organized a family dinner, ostensibly to make peace. But when Jake arrived and met the other guest, Marcus Bennett, successful lawyer, wealthy family son, he understood it was a trap. The dinner was surreal. The mother ignored Jake as if he were invisible, constantly addressing Marcus. Marcus spoke to Emily with that condescension kind people use with the disabled, speaking too slowly and loudly. Jake saw Emily shrink, becoming silent, submissive, invisible, and something in him broke. Midway through dinner, when the mother made another comment about how Marcus would be a more suitable partner, Jake stood up. All eyes turned to him, and he did something completely insane. He started signing, not to Emily, but to her family, knowing they wouldn't understand. He signed everything, how blind they were not to see how extraordinary their daughter was, how strong she was for surviving a family that treated her as defective, how brave she was. He turned to Emily and signed, "You're perfect." And if they can't see it, they're the ones who are deaf, not you. Then he left, walking toward the bus station, heart pounding hard, uncertain if he'd just saved or destroyed everything. 10 minutes later, Emily reached him running down the street, still in her elegant dress and heels. Her eyes were red, but she smiled brilliantly. She signed, hands trembling. "I told my mother if she has to choose, she chooses you, always you." Jake took her in his arms on the street. He had learned an entire language for her. She had chosen him above everything. Maybe their love was crazy. Maybe the world would never understand. But they understood each other, and that was all that mattered. 1 year later, Matthews Auto Repair had a new sign. It was now called Matthews Carter Auto, and next to the old dusty garage was a new modern building. Not just a shop, but a vocational training center for deaf and hard-of-hearing youth, the first of its kind in all of Texas. It was Emily's project, funded by her inheritance, but inspired by Jake. She wanted to create a place where people like her could learn practical trades, where deafness wasn't seen as an obstacle, but simply as a characteristic. Jake had become the lead instructor, teaching mechanics in a language he now spoke fluently. Their wedding had been small and perfect. No grand ceremony in Houston's elegant churches. Instead, they married in a public garden in Austin, with Jake's mother as witness and an ASL interpreter who translated the vows for hearing guests. Emily's mother hadn't come, but her brother had, and that was enough. Bill had retired, leaving the shop in Jake's capable hands, who now managed both operations with efficiency that surprised everyone. Business was better than ever. Not only because the deaf community had finally found a shop where they knew they'd be understood, but because Jake and Emily's story had become local legend. Tabloids tried to turn it into a soap opera fairy tale, The Millionaire and the Mechanic. But anyone who really knew their story knew it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a real story of two people who found each other when both most needed to be found. Emily had transformed her isolation into mission. She started campaigns for accessibility, using her wealth and connections to change laws, open conversations, make the world slightly better for deaf people. She was no longer invisible by choice or shame. She was seen because she chose to be seen. On her terms. Jake hadn't transformed into a millionaire in designer clothes. He was still the guy with dirty hands and a clean heart, who woke early to check on his mother before work, who ate at the same cheap diner he'd always loved. But now he had something worth more than all the money in the world, a partner who saw him exactly for who he was and loved him for it. They bought a house together, not in Emily's family mansion or Jake's suburban apartment, but something in between. A modest house in a normal neighborhood where neighbors brought welcome cakes and didn't care how much they earned. In that house, every evening they sat on the couch and talked. Jake signed stories of his day, people he met, engines he fixed. Emily signed her foundation plans, the battles she was fighting, small triumphs and big frustrations. And in those moments, in the silence of their home, full of the language of their hands, they were perfectly happy. Emily's mother eventually reached out, not with apologies but with silent acceptance. She came to visit, saw the training center, saw how deaf people flourished under her daughter and Jake's guidance. She never learned sign language, but she learned to respect those who had. 2 years after the wedding, Emily and Jake had a daughter. She was born hearing, but they created a bilingual environment for her, teaching her both spoken English and ASL from birth. She grew knowing that communication comes in many forms, that people have value regardless of their abilities, that love is the most important thing. They named her Sarah, and when she was just 3, she already signed fluently, translating between her grandmother Carter and her mother with an ease that made both parents smile. Years later, when they interviewed Jake for an article on successful social entrepreneurs, they asked what motivated him to learn sign language in the first place. He smiled and gave a simple but true answer. He said he saw someone who needed to be understood and did the only thing that made sense. He learned to speak her language, not out of pity or to impress, but because when you love someone, you learn to communicate in the ways they need, not just the ways that are convenient. And Emily, reading the article later, cried. Not tears of sadness, but deep gratitude. Gratitude for that day when a broken Ferrari brought her to a dirty shop where a young mechanic saw her when everyone else looked through her. Because sometimes true luxury isn't what you can buy with money. It's finding someone willing to learn an entire language just to know you. It's being loved not despite who you are, but exactly for who you are. It's building a world together where you can both be seen, heard, understood. And in the silence filled with signs in their home, every evening, Jake and Emily reminded themselves how fortunate they were. Not for the money or success or material things, but for finding each other in a world that tried to keep them apart, for choosing love when everything said it was impossible, for building something beautiful from the ashes of judgment and misunderstanding. Their love didn't need words spoken aloud. It spoke perfectly in the language of hands, in the language of sacrifice, in the universal language of two people who truly see each other and choose to stay day after day in a noisy world that finally learned to listen to their eloquent silence. If this story made you believe that true love overcomes every barrier, leave a little heart down below. And if you really want to support stories like this that remind us of the value of kindness and understanding in a world that often forgets, you can leave a thanks a million through the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Jake's choice to learn a language just to see Emily's smile, because you made it to the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonists of this story.